flexibility and demand. And chairing the session is going to be Derek Stenclik, co-founder of Telos Energy. And come on in, sit down, and yeah, let's get started. Thanks.
Great. Thanks everybody for making your way up from the third or to the third floor away from all the food. Hopefully we'll get some folks trickling in here. So this session's around flexibility and demand. We've got a great panel. I'm going to do something a little bit atypical where the chair of the session, I'm going to start off with a few slides, just highlighting some of the work that we're doing with eSig right now around demand response and really trying to understand some of the gaps. And hopefully by doing that, I can set the stage for the speakers to really go more in depth. So I'll start off with 5 minutes and then we'll switch over to the speakers. And Akhilesh is coming next. I think Akhilesh, the Brattle team, others in the industry have done a lot of great work showing the potential or the economic potential for demand response or load flexibility more general. So this is coming from Brattle's national potential for load flexibility. They showed a huge growth from 60 gigawatts up to potentially 200 of potential. And basically some of that's coming from expanded new programs, but a lot of it's coming from potential new programs and then just new technologies that are inherently more flexible coming onto the system. So a lot of work in the space has shown this very large potential of the resource, right? But we're not seeing that really show up. And so this is some work from some of the EIA data forums. There's a lot of imperfect data around how much demand response is out there. That's a key issue that we've identified in the industry. But no matter how you look at it, you see the other technologies kind of what I would call the energy transition, whether it's wind, solar, or battery. Kind of this chart is just looking at percent change year over year, or cumulative from over the last 10 years. And you can see rapid growth in wind, solar, batteries, and we are seeing very flat and even negative growth in demand response or load flexibility. And so why is it? There's this big potential. We're not seeing it show up in the marketplace and what's going on. And here's a chart of the wholesale demand response in ISO and RTOs. So on the left-hand side, we have it in cumulative capacity. On the right-hand side, we just have it as normalized as a percentage of demand in each region. So again, a couple outliers, some markets, you do see some growth, but all in all, we're seeing essentially flat or even declining demand response in wholesale markets. So what's going on? We see a potential. We're not seeing it show up in the markets. Why is that? Is there a gap? So as part of an eSig initiative, we put together kind of interviews with over a dozen kind of industry experts from aggregators, utilities, ISOs, researchers, really wanted to understand, is there a gap? And if so, why is that happening? What are the barriers? And how can we overcome that? So we have a new report coming out very soon, hopefully in the next couple months here, maybe month, that really goes through the top 5 gaps. And I wanted to start with this for this session to really identify these gaps. And as you listen to the next 4 folks on the panel, start to think of, okay, do these gaps resonate? How might some of their experiences help solve some of these gaps? The first, just around lack of experience and knowledge. I think a lot of people, you get in, people are throwing around terms like virtual power plant. Nobody really has a great definition of that. There's you just lack of experience, I think, across the industry. I kind of look back at where battery storage was maybe 10 years ago, where everybody knew the technology was there, but the experience across the industry, whether it's from regulators or in the utility or in the development community, just wasn't there. So I think a lot of great work kind of for eSig and others to do, kind of get this word out there, get the case studies out there. Second, the biggest, this is probably the most important one, is just market fragmentation and inconsistent rules as you work across the country. In some of the interviews, we were talking to aggregators and I said, what's your favorite ISO market to work in? They said, PJM. I said, oh, what's so unique about the market rules in PJM that you really like? And they're like, no, it has nothing to do with the market rules. It's just a really big market with the same market rules. And that's the most important. And they just said it's a 160 gigawatt market and we can go with a consistent set of rules and go just tackle a large market share. And that was the most important thing to them. It wasn't the specifics of the rules, it was the consistency of the rules across a wide area. Third is around difficult interconnection and metering rules. I think as an industry, we're used to dealing with multi-100 megawatt scale plants. and the interconnection and metering that go with that. And we're at times trying to push that down into the kilowatt scale, like same revenue grade meter on your EV charger. Do we need that in order to have participation in some of these programs? Fourth, around lack of detailed performance data during grid events. There's frankly a lot of mistrust in load flexibility, especially when it comes to reliability. Like if you don't know you can count on it, people are very quick to discredit it, right? And so I think the first thing we can do in that is start really giving, every time we call on demand response, let's make sure the response that we see or that we measure or that we estimate, let's get that out there, make sure that it's clear, the performance. And you're seeing a lot of ISOs, RTOs, utilities now start to accredit demand response and look at ELCC or other metrics to accredit their response. I think the performance is not the issue, whether it's good or bad, it's how we accredit the resource. So if we are over accrediting or under accrediting the resource, that's where the problem lies. And then lastly, around weak financial incentives. At the end of the day, the majority of ratepayers across the country are paying a flat volumetric rate. Doesn't give them much incentive to start thinking about how they can manage their loads or bring in new technologies to manage their load. And if that incentive isn't there, there's limited reason why they would actually enroll in a demand response program. If they have to go through all the headache of the enabling technologies, understanding how those rates work. So we think there's a big opportunity for rate design and demand response programs to work together. So that's how I wanted to kick off. Again, just to get you thinking, lay the ground of why are we seeing not a large growth. We've identified 5 kind of underlying gaps, and I'd encourage you to think about those gaps as you hear about the experiences from the panel. So with that, I'll introduce Akhilesh Ramakrishnan from Brattle Group. I highlighted some of him and his team's work there in the beginning on demand response potential. They've done a lot of really great work in this space to really showcase, I think, not only what the current technology can do, but what the technology is potentially capable. And I think really important as we start planning out the system for the future. So Akhilesh, please take it from here.
Good morning. Yeah, so hi everyone, Akhilesh Ramakrishnan. I lead our DER planning and electrification work and do a lot of work on load flexibility and load flexibility potential, working with my colleagues, Ryan Hleddick and Kate Peters. You might have seen a lot of our recent reports around VPP potential for Google Grid Lab, some of our most recent work. I'm going to be talking about some upcoming work we have that's about to be published with Lawrence Berkeley National Labs. And Derek, your introduction kind of set this up really well. We're focusing on kind of one aspect of the 5 gaps that you outlined. In this report, we're looking specifically at the barriers to customers enrolling in these VPPs at scale and how utilities can kind of set up new programs and scale enrollment in existing programs and make that process smoother for customers. But before I get into that, just wanted to give some kind of high-level background on where VPPs are right now and the opportunity to scale them. So we're sort of at an inflection point when it comes to demand growth and the supply that has to be built to serve that. So if we're looking at recent history in the last 7 years from 2016 to 2023, demand growth was pretty stagnant. It was about a 3% growth over those whole 7 years. And that had a lot to do with scaling up of efficiency programs, still kind of overhang from the demand reductions from the financial recession. And so that was pretty limited growth. That we're looking at a paradigm shift in where demand growth is going to go in the next 7 years and beyond that. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen kind of the press recently about how massive the growth is going to be around especially data centers and AI. And there's also all of the decarbonization measures that are going to be highly electrification focused. So that's going to be about 4x increase in the amount of growth compared to the last 7 years, in about 100 gigawatts. At the same time, on the supply side, in the last 7 years, investment kind of didn't really go down with demand. There was persistent investment because plants were retiring. There was a transition away from coal. So it was about 83 gigawatts of capacity added in the last 7 years. But in the next 7 years, to deal with this accelerated growth and continuing retirements of fossil plants, there's going to have to be much more growth. About 3x the capacity needs to be added to meet this 100 gigawatts of additional demand that's going to come into the system and also replace the retiring generation. And this is looking like a huge challenge, especially now given the recent context of supply chain shortages, huge delayed interconnection queue. And at the same time, there's kind of the affordability aspect of all of this to focus on, where this building out all of this capacity has to be done on time to connect new loads and also to keep it affordable for customers. So kind of that's the context for why we need more innovative solutions to address this, kind of upcoming supply demand gap, and VPPs are one solution to this gap. So kind of jumping to the opportunity for VPPs, first we can look at where demand response capability is today. And what this chart is showing is the DR capability as a percentage of utility peak load at all of the investor-owned utilities in the US. So kind of one striking feature of this is there are some utilities that are actually doing extremely well. They have, as a percentage of their peak load, about 7% or higher in terms of capability at the top 10% of utilities in the US. And a second striking feature of this is how quickly that falls off. You can see that the top 10% are kind of doing much better than the remaining 90%. And there's actually about 25% of utilities aren't even shown on this chart because they're at 0%. So, each utility is different. They have different customer characteristics. They're going to have different kind of opportunities and sectors where demand response is possible. But just looking at this from a top-down perspective, if you scaled the entire bottom 90% of utilities up to the level where that 10th percentile utility is right now, that's an additional 25 gigawatts of capacity. So that's huge, kind of in the context of the demand growth that we just discussed on the previous slide. That was about 100 gigawatts over the next 7 years. 25 gigawatts is a quarter of that. And this is, kind of just based on today's level of demand. There's going to be additional opportunities for VPP potential as demand grows, because with new demand and new end uses comes more load that can be managed. And so it's also important to consider where DER growth is going to be in the next couple of decades. The penetration of smart devices is going to grow. There's going to be more electrified devices, EVs, water heating, space heating, all of which can add to flexibility potential. So this kind of brings us to why we're doing this work right now, because as I mentioned, it's kind of an inflection point and a potentially once in a generation opportunity to kind of sign up all of these new devices that are going to come into the system to participate in VPPs as they're being adopted. So kind of you have a chance to condition customers to this as just the status quo way of operating things. Some customers may have an EV that has never not been in a flexibility program. And it's kind of the opportunity to do that and set that up is right now. So to introduce the work that's going to be released soon with LBNL, we focused on identifying strategies that the largest programs in the country and most successful emerging programs in the country have used to already achieve success in kind of scaling up customer enrollment really quickly, look at kind of the different strategies they've used to set up those pilots and take the pilots from pilot stage to full-scale programs. And the idea was to kind of make this a guide for other utilities who are hoping to expand their programs or set up new programs to do that in a way where they're learning from the experience of the already successful programs. So this was all primarily done through an interview-based format with some additional literature review. We spoke with 15 VPP administrators across utilities and aggregators and kind of platform providers to discuss how they scaled their programs successfully. And the main focus of the interviews was on the strategies they used to smoothly enroll customers, and once customers were in the program, how to retain them in the program and give them a good experience. This also included a survey where we kind of, once we heard what all of these strategies were, we asked the interviewees to rank the strategies in terms of what's most important, what had the highest impact, and also provide a view of how easy these strategies are to implement. So kind of the output of all of this can serve as a way for new programs to prioritize, kind of where to focus their efforts. So there were 30 strategies identified in this report. So, given that I have like 15 minutes, I'm going to skip most of them. But we have categorized them under these 5 high-level categories. One is marketing programs to customers. Kind of what are the different strategies that these programs are using to send customers the right message, give them the right information that will help them make the decision about signing up. 2, and probably the most important aspect identified through these interviews, was how to structure the enrollment process. And it's kind of a recurring theme of all of the interviews was what we heard from these successful programs was that the key is like customers want to sign up for these things. They like earning money for providing flexibility to the grid, but you have to make it easy for them to sign up. They're not going to put in, 2 hours of filling in forms to get like $50 of an upfront incentive. So kind of making that process smooth is really crucial. 3, working with ecosystem partners. And what we mean by that is usually OEMs, for, like especially for things like EV programs, where there could be a third party that customers trust to provide information about this sort of thing, in addition to hearing from utilities and kind of technology partners. 4, getting the customer incentive structure is crucial. There's also something Derek kind of opened up with, and something that's a personal favorite thing of mine to work on is kind of how to set up these programs to make sure that you're aligning incentives with what actually creates value on the grid, but also in a way that is convenient for customers to participate in this type of program. And 5, once customers are in the program, it's really important to keep them in the program. So what are some strategies to make sure they have a good experience? So who we interviewed is, there were, out of the 15 interviewees, 8 of them were utilities. There were kind of a pretty diverse mix here of different types of DER technologies that are represented. There were a couple of storage programs, EV programs, a big focus on smart thermostat programs, which are kind of the smart thermostats along with AC were some of the first forms of demand response. And so those are some of the largest programs now. And also a pretty good geographic diversity. We have, some of the utilities in the West, Northeast, and, the Dakotas as well. And my co-panelist from Xcel is kind of represented here too, so I'm sure he can talk more about the Xcel programs as well. So a lot of these utilities are kind of in that top 10 percentile that I shared in the beginning, and some of the other ones also have, you know, kind of innovative emerging programs for some of the newer technologies. We also spoke to aggregators and technology platform providers kind of across these three categories of you know, customer classes. So there were Energy Hub, Renew Home, and Uplight, who are focused on kind of residential whole home services. They do smart thermostats, but also kind of just a general manager of different end uses in the home. Spoke to C-Power and Voltus, who are focused more on the C&I sector. And that takes a lot more kind of bespoke solutions for some of these industrial customers with you know, unique needs and end uses. And also a big EV focus. We spoke to EV.Energy and WeaveGrid, who are kind of focused on the residential EV demand response. So with that, I'm going to kind of start getting into the 30 strategies. How am I doing on time? Oh, perfect. That's a lot less time than I thought. So yeah, I might go through maybe 5 strategies. But so some of the most important strategies here, and kind of looking at the way the interviewees ranked them on this plot to the left, basically you want to be to the top left end of this chart with the easiest to implement strategies that have the highest impact. And some of these are just going to seem like no-brainers, right? Send concise messaging about program benefits in marketing materials. The main message should just be, hey, you can get an upfront incentive of $50 and we'll pay you, you know, $100 every year you're in the program. Then include a little bit more detail about kind of the community impact, greenhouse gas emissions impact, things like that, to also motivate customers who are motivated by that. But kind of the marketing side of this, I would say, is pretty, you know, kind of straightforward things that we heard here. In the enrollment process, I just want to stress again that making this the process of actually signing up for the program seamless was probably the #1 theme that we heard. And it's interesting that it's actually not that easy to do, because it takes a lot of data integration and you know, dealing with security concerns to make sure that, you know, to do something like pre-populate a customer's meter number in the form. The utility has to have the, you know, be comfortable with the aggregator's security protocols to be able to say, hey, if you're going to sign up a customer, I'll give you the customer's meter number, account number, or usage data. All of that kind of takes a lot of data integration, standardization across utility IT systems, so there's not a huge overhead for these technology companies to integrate with them. So it's pretty hard to do, but it was something we heard as you know, maybe the second most important thing for these programs to do. And then another couple of pretty important strategies is point of sale enrollment and pre-enrolling devices. This kind of goes back to, it's a once in a generation opportunity to sign up all of these new kinds of devices in these programs right as they're being adopted. And you know, one of the best ways to do that is to have them enrolled as soon as they're adopted. Opt-out programs are also another way to do that that has had success in some areas. Ecosystem partners. This was, as I mentioned, kind of focused on EVs, where, you know, customers in general would see their automaker as a more trusted source of information about kind of what is good for their car, how they should you know, structure their charging behavior. And so especially for EV programs, kind of having that EV OEM partner for utility programs can be key to making it successful. And it also provides another way to directly control the vehicle through telematics, make sure you have data from multiple sources, from the charger, from what the EV OEM has access to. So especially there, that can be key. And on incentive design, this is the number one kind of strategy that we heard was just, and this is obvious, maximize the financial incentive as much as possible. One of the interesting things we heard with respect to smart thermostat programs was it's actually better not to give them away for free, because then you end up with a huge kind of free rider issue where people just take them but never install them. So it's good to kind of keep the behavioral aspect in mind when setting up the incentive structure, and set that up in a way where customers are actually going to do what kind of is the intention behind these programs. Also want to mention financing specifically on this list because it's a pretty important strategy, especially for low-income customers, where making it smooth to get financing for the more expensive devices like storage can be really important to bring those customers along. And finally, engagement and retention. It's more important to continuously improve these programs over time. Remind customers of their rewards. This kind of goes back to the behavioral aspect of this, and sending payments through channels that customers notice. So for example, doing Venmo or PayPal payments instead of on bill, just bill reductions. I think I'm almost at time, so I'll wrap this up pretty quickly. Final recommendations were for regulators to kind of use this as a checklist to make sure that pilot proposals are kind of structured the right way and have a plan to scale even at when they're being proposed as pilots. For utilities to kind of benchmark programs against these 30 strategies, think about them when requesting additional funding, figure out kind of what the impact of that will be and how these strategies can be integrated into that. And for aggregators who are kind of on the ground and doing the great work of making all of this happen, bringing the data that they're getting from all of that effort, kind of advocating for the right solutions in a coordinated fashion, are kind of some of the recommendations that are coming out of this. So I'll stop with that and pass it on to Zach.
Thank you, Akhilesh. I was thinking through the DR programs I'm enrolled in, and props to kind of Google Nest, which made it really easy to enroll. But I will say I get chewed out by my family every time that gets activated in the middle of the summer. So, but on the other hand, my EV and the time of use rate, terrible to enroll. I had to like print out a contract, sign it, give them a copy of my registration, mail it in, get something back. So yeah, a lot of lessons learned there. There we go. So in some of the interviews that we've had with folks from the industry, something stood out. A couple regions that had like really good demand response program. We spoke to one person and she said, well, I'm the queen of DR. Everybody calls me the queen of DR in the company. I've been doing it for 10 years. This is my baby. Not surprisingly, that entity had really good demand response participation. We went to some other regions and we're trying to find the demand response person to interview. Couldn't find them. Talked to people in the company. Who is it? We don't know. That region didn't have great demand response participation. So we were asking a lot of people, well, who are some folks to exemplify, like who's doing this really well? Xcel kept coming up over and over. And I think Akhilesh kind of mentioned that as well as one of the kind of folks that are really doing this well. And again, one of the things that came out of an interview actually with Akhilesh's counterpart was, at the end of the day, like this does come down to people, and there's individuals that are championing these programs at different utilities, different ISOs and RTOs, and it can really make a difference. And I think that really stood out to me. So a lot can be done. And I think Zach, your name, Xcel's name kept coming up over and over. So major props to you. Looking forward to learning more about this.
Good morning. Let's try that again. Good morning. Great to be here. My name is Zach Pollock. I'm Director of Grid Strategy in Xcel Energy's Integrated System Planning Group. A little bit about that before I jump into the content here. So about 2 years ago, Our CEO went to our then OpCo president in Colorado, Alice Jackson, and said, I want you to go lead a group that is responsible for breaking down the silos across our organization, from generation planning, transmission planning, distribution planning, gas planning, et cetera, and go figure out what the future of our energy system is going to look like. So I'm part of that group. I lead a small strategy team that works pretty closely with our planning groups that have moved over into that organization, and excited to talk a little bit about what we're doing with load flexibility today. Very much appreciate the call out and being a leader in the industry, but I will say that, you know, with what we're facing, the dynamics of the changing industry, it's not enough. So we've got further to go on that. So a little bit about Xcel. We sort of make up a sliver of the country west of the Midwest. Most of our customers are in Colorado and Minnesota, with apologies to Nebraska, but we somehow sort of skipped that over when we were going through mergers and acquisitions. So we make up that nice little sliver in the middle of the country. Got about 3.8 million electric customers and importantly, 2.2 million gas customers. So that transition is something that we're thinking about, not just across the electric sector, but across both commodities. For a state that isn't on the coast, we consider ourselves to be a pretty big leader in terms of installation and deployment of distributed energy resources. Got about 1 gigawatt of rooftop solar on a 7 gigawatt system in Colorado, and sort of the inverse of that in Minnesota with more community solar, but similar proportions relative to system peak. And we credit ourselves with really being one of the leaders of leading the clean energy transition across all of our commodities. So we were one of the first energy providers to come out with a net zero goal across all of our commodities. What that means is 80% carbon reduction by 2030 from the power generation sector. We're well on the way to do that. We're at about 55% carbon-free energy today, and that's largely through a combination of wind energy, nuclear, solar, et cetera, and distributed energy as well. And then we're trying to get to zero carbon by 2050. On the gas side, we're looking to be a net zero provider by 2050. There's a lot of challenges decarbonizing the gas sector. We published what we consider to be one of the industry-leading plans in doing that in Colorado last year. So we're looking forward to seeing how our customers respond to that and start adopting measures that will help us decarbonize our gas business. And then finally, the last element of that is decarbonizing the transportation sector. So we want to have, by 2030, 1 in 5 EVs be vehicles of our fleet in our state for all of our customers, and then have zero carbon fuel be accessible within 1 mile by 2050. So I always think it's helpful to start with where we've been to understand where we're going. So I think I'm going to try to wrap up about 100 years of electric utility industry history in about 90 seconds here. But if you go back to really the 1930s and 1940s, we recognize as a country through the Rural Electrification Act that we need to go build out infrastructure because of the benefits and services that electricity provides to our customers. So that period of rapid load growth, mobilization, infrastructure build out largely persisted, I would argue, into the 1960s. People started to get access to televisions, later on air conditioning, and we largely lived in that era of load growth until the 1970s. Enter the energy crises of the 70s, PURPA, that really led to a period of conservation and efficiency. And that largely persisted into the early 2000s when the policy winds and economics started to shift in favor of starting to decarbonize the power generation sector. And that is largely where we've still been until today. So we focus a lot of our efforts, both as an industry and us as a company at Xcel, in decarbonizing power generation. As I said before, we're at about 55% carbon-free energy today, but that's come at sometimes the cost of prioritizing those types of investments and initiatives over things that we're today seeing are incredibly important in helping decarbonize other parts of the economy that our energy delivery system, the combination of transmission, distribution, or gas networks, is responsible for providing. So in my view, we're kind of back at the beginning of this inflection point that we really haven't seen for the last 100 years. But it's not just the Kevin Costner Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. It's if you build it, they will come. And by the way, they're data centers, they're EVs, they're heat pumps, the room is on fire and the floor is lava. So every utility and dutiful consultant probably has a slide that looks a lot like this. I won't spend too much time on here, but it's just a recognition of the way the industry is changing and has changed over the last 100 years. It used to be a pretty straightforward equation. Power flowed from generation to transmission to load centers to customers. Today, that problem and that challenge has become a lot more complex. We're starting to see rapid adoption of distributed energy resources on our system. That's starting to include things like electric vehicles and heat pumps. We're starting to backfeed on our transmission system. So all these challenges that you heard some of the panelists in the session this morning talk about are all reasons why we need to break down our silos for planning. What hasn't really changed up until this point is thinking about the flexibility in the system, right? So historically, we've planned generation to meet demand, and that demand has really been discussed in the context of overall coincident peak demand on the system, not necessarily the demand at customer premises or on the distribution system, which are critical drivers of investment. So thinking about, as an integrated planning organization, how we plan for the future, I'll spend most of the rest of the presentation talking about this last pillar here, but I did want to emphasize the first 2 points on the slide as well. We are entering this inflection point where we haven't seen this type of load growth in this level of uncertainty probably in about 100 years. And no amount of demand response, virtual power plants, non-wires alternatives are going to obviate the need for investment. So the question and the answer really becomes a yes-and question and a yes-and answer. In addition to that, we need to do a better job maximizing the use of our existing and new infrastructure as we put that steel on the ground. That comes down to a lot of the unsexy things like asset health and reliability programs, but that's going to be incredibly important as we deploy new capital, new infrastructure. And finally, the last bit here is looking at ways that we can help defer, avoid, and reduce some of the need for that infrastructure, given that the expected impact from a capital and ultimately a rate and affordability perspective for our customers. And that's where we really view load flexibility and some of the offshoots of that coming in as a critical piece of the equation here. So pretty simple construct, but one that's somewhat beautiful in its simplicity, right? If you think about how we plan our system and make capital investments today, it's largely based upon the concept of a single peak demand. That can be an hour, it can be a group of hours, it may be by season. But generally what that results in is about 60% of our assets are not utilized to its full set of capabilities. So, and that, as I said earlier, in this period we're entering now with exponential load growth, that is going to drive a lot of capital investment that's not going to be able to be fully utilized if we continue down this existing paradigm today. So what does it look like to be able to do that from a load flexibility perspective? If you think about the traditional planning process today, you go through and as a planner, whether you're in transmission or distribution, you calculate your available hosting capacity or available connection capacity on the system. You allocate that based on static thermal limits or voltage limits that are based upon worst case scenarios. It's particularly true of distribution planning because historically we haven't had the visibility and the awareness at the edge of the system. And then you basically implement your physical and operational limits and basically put that steel on the ground, set it and forget it. What that planning process could look like in the future as we start to get more visibility, more awareness, and potentially more control and communication out at the grid edge is moving more to a concept that's often referred to as a dynamic operating envelope. So rather than setting a piece of infrastructure based upon a deterministic planning scenario and a deterministic limit, what if you could actually in real time sample the grid to understand how DERs, how load may actually be impacting the system on a real-time basis? That opens up a world of opportunities in terms of the way that we plan and operate our system. Now, it doesn't come without challenges. I mean, that's going to mean new things from an operational perspective, but it's a completely new paradigm that allows us to maximize the use of our system and our assets, ultimately a way that makes for more dynamic and more efficient use of the system. So about a year ago, our chief planning officer, Alice Jackson, went to our vice president of our customer energy solutions team and said, I want you to go figure out a way to bring me 20% of our load being flexible in every hour of every day. I wasn't there for the conversation, but you can probably imagine what his reaction was. And after he picked his job off the floor, we started going down this path of what it would take to get there. So I'll hit a few of the things that we're starting to do at Xcel to help us go down this vision of just getting us beyond being, the leader that Akhilesh had been there from a traditional DR perspective, and really thinking about load from a flexibility perspective on our system in a way that can provide new benefits. So first and foremost, improving visibility. As I mentioned before, we've historically been blind to a lot of the system, particularly the distribution system. We're in the process of deploying the latest generation of smart meters that gives us enhanced granularity at the edge of our system. That data is becoming increasingly more valuable. It's also becoming increasingly more requested by users of that information. So part of what we're doing to enable this flexibility is bringing all that into a unified data platform so that it's accessible to our planning teams, our operation teams, our customer teams, et cetera. Second piece of this is leveraging DERs as an asset. So if you think about historically how DERs have been deployed and incentivized on our system, they've largely benefited the direct participants of those assets. So in Colorado today, we have about 1 gigawatt of rooftop solar. That's all incentivized under traditional net metering. We need to be shifting that paradigm, whether it's through rate design or whether it's through control, through something like a DERMS, to be able to use those assets to provide value, not just to direct participants, but also the broader system at the bulk system level, as well as distribution. Standardized communications. This is an issue we run into all the time with our vendors. Everyone's got a custom API or they've got a custom integration. You may talk 2030.5, but it's a different version of 2030.5 than somebody else. So definitely a strong interest in moving the industry to more standardized communications so that we can ultimately be interoperable and be able to work with multiple vendors and aggregators. And then finally, the last piece, this is one that's not often covered, is operational change management. There's simplicity for our line crews and workers who obviously safety is the utmost priority for them. When they put an asset in the field, if they're setting it and not having to go back and worry about whether or not the DERMS or the ADMS is operating correctly today, there's a real implication for operational change management, making sure that our operations folks are comfortable with the way that we might use load flexibility on our system in the future. So just want to highlight that. I do it on time. Okay, so a few ways that Xcel is going about doing this today. I talked about AMI a little bit, but that really, in my view, is the foundation to getting better understanding of what we're able to do on the edge of the system. So we're deploying the latest generation of meters. We're using a combination of analytics on the backhauled 15-minute interval data that we're starting to get, as well as actually looking at processing power on the meter. The latest generation of meters have substantially more capabilities on them than the first generation of smart meters. So looking at that both from an understanding what's happening on the grid, and then also potentially doing some onboard computing to help us manage load at the edge of the system. From an analysis perspective, we're starting to use that data, not just to plan to that single deterministic peak, but help us understand from an hourly and an annual basis what the shape of load looks like on the system. So typically referred as an 8760 analysis. That is starting to underpin how we do our distribution planning, and more critically, our distribution planning using that bottom-up data and forecasting process is starting to be fed into our other processes that have historically been run top-down. That's primarily generation planning and transmission planning. We're also moving away from deterministic planning, looking at one scenario and a budget, to more of a probabilistic and stochastic model. That's something we're just starting now, but really want to reiterate the point that was made by the earlier panel, which is that the future is going to be incredibly uncertain, and we're doing ourselves as an industry a disservice if we only plan to one potential future. So can't emphasize enough how critical it is to plan to a range of scenarios and understand those implications. And then finally, the last bit is integrating the flexibility in planning and operations. So we are starting to challenge some of our static planning limits. Today, we have a 75% planning limit for a distribution system, meaning that you can't go above 75%. With the ability to introduce visibility, control, and communications to certain assets, we're challenging ourselves to say, what if we can go above that and basically disavow some of the knowledge that we've gained over the years, that once you introduce those capabilities, you actually can manage the system dynamically. You don't need to worry about your worst case conditions that may only happen for a few hours of the year. And finally, in the technology side, we're starting to embrace some of the new technologies. DERMS is the big one that a lot of folks like to talk about. Our strategy for that is we feel like the industry is not really at a point where there's one single DERMS vendor that can do everything. So we're looking at DERMS as really an ecosystem approach of bringing in vendors that are good on the customer side, good on the grid side, and the operational technology side to help us piece together a set of technologies that really lead to different business process outcomes and results. So about 30 seconds left here. How does all this align to what we're trying to do as an industry, and critically for us, our strategic initiatives at Xcel Energy? So on the bottom of the slide here, our strategic initiatives. Leading the clean energy transition is definitely high on the list. We've done that historically through a lot of investment in bulk scale generation, but we know that our customers want to put DERs on the system. So for us, we're trying to find a way to transform those DERs in a way that they still provide customer benefits, but also provide a benefit to the system. as the penetration level increases of those assets, we're also starting to see operational and planning issues. So we're trying to find ways through that better visibility and communications to begin to mitigate some of the operational impacts that we're starting to see in the system. Enhancing the customer experience. So that's a key one for us as well. If you think about the rate of change that I alluded to on the earlier slide here, there is no way we're going to be able to build infrastructure fast enough in the planning timelines that are required for new substations, new feeders, with all the permitting and supply chain issues we've seen over the last couple of years. So we're looking at using flexibility as a way of providing interim solutions to customers, whether that be on the load side or the generation side, to be able to bring customers online faster. And then finally, the last bit, and this again was a good topic that was broached in the earlier panel, is keeping customer bills low. So if you think about that 60% asset utilization, if you're able to cram more kilowatt hours underneath your asset base without changing the assets that you need to invest in, you have the ability to put downward pressure on rates from a customer perspective for some of the infrastructure that we've all, I think, nodded in violent agreement here today that we're going to need as an industry. So bringing more sales, whether it be through managed charging, load flexibility programs, et cetera, under the same asset base is going to be a critical element of enabling the clean energy transition in a way that's affordable for our customers. So I'll end just quickly on a really interesting case study. We were just recently awarded about 2 weeks ago a virtual power plant application under the Department of Energy's Distributed Energy Systems FOA. So we're going to be working with the city and county of Boulder. For those that don't know or are not familiar with Colorado, Boulder has extremely aggressive decarbonization and clean energy goals, very much alike to what Xcel is trying to do. There also have been a leader as far as the community in terms of adoption of distributed energy resources. So a really good test bed for testing some of the concepts that some of the other panelists have talked about up here so far. What we're doing there is going to have a heavy focus on the distribution system. So a lot of our leadership in load flexibility and demand response has been focused on the bulk system. Over the next couple of years, we're going to be working with Boulder to be able to better understand and deploy resources in a way that actually manages impacts on the distribution system. So while there's definitely opportunity for bulk system benefits, we really feel, given what we're seeing from a planning perspective on the distribution side, we have to be exploring use cases and opportunities using aggregated DERs and VPP context to be able to mitigate and some of the impacts on the distribution system. So overall, we're expecting about a 31% load growth for the Boulder area, and then a 61% increase in DER. So the earlier comments, we absolutely have an interest in making sure as we bring additional DER into the system, it's done in a way that can support the broader community and our broader system as Xcel Energy. I think that's my last slide.
All right, thank you, Zach. Perfect segue into our next presentation from Peter Markussen from Energinet. So thank you, Peter, for making the long trip over. And yeah, Zach's last slide there talking about all the new technologies and the new DERs coming in. And Akhilesh also mentioned there's kind of this inflection point with all this new stuff coming in. We're at a critical spot because it can be flexible, but it's not guaranteed to be flexible if we don't set it up and if we don't integrate it right the first time. So Peter's going to talk about the opportunities in the future where maybe half of demand can be flexible.
Yeah, thank you very much, Derek, for the introduction, and also glad to be here. And I'm trying to get the most out of my long trip. So this is my third presentation here. So maybe some of you have heard me before, but still, I will introduce myself. I'm from the Danish system operator Energinet, and where I've been working a lot with flexibility, especially for balancing and ancillary services, but also flexibility in general. So this is one of the areas that I really love. So very glad to see there's also a lot going on here in the US. So to start with, you can actually say this might be the conclusion, because we see a lot of flexibility now in our Danish electricity system, or actually in Europe. And what has brought it there? That is a number of things, and I've tried to separate it in. On the one hand, the structural changes that we've seen over the last 10 years, that has facilitated the flexibility we see now. And that is the market development. It's the regulation we have on with focus on efficiency, both carrots and sticks. And it's also a consumer awareness of energy use. Then we have had the technology development with smart meters, the apps in the phones, digitalizations. We have what we in Denmark call the data hub, maybe what you will call the DERM. Say we have one place where you have all the data, and then you have transparency in that and can get access to consumer, producer, and own data. Then there is the electrification of heating and energy use in general. So electricity is a larger share of your costs in the household because you use more electricity instead of oil and gas. Then there has been a lot of general support, public support, and also from our side in consumer flexibility and have it included as part of the energy planning. We have seen a new tariff design also that then facilitates flexibility with time different rates, and also a change where we go from both an energy but also a fixed rate. Then there is the whole ancillary service setup where you say it's a relatively small market, but there is a very high value in the ancillary services. So that has also started the interest from consumption in being more flexible. Then we have the prosumers, you say those that have rooftop solar. They're also getting more interested in what is my electricity price, because if you don't use your own electricity, then you actually have to pay to get it out in the grid. And finally, also focus on using green electricity. So you want to know each hour, is my electricity green or not green? And finally, we now see a lot of electrical vehicles. At the moment, around 50% of all new vehicles is electrical vehicles. So now around 20% of all vehicles in Denmark are electrical. And most of us, we have then a home charger, and we would like to charge when the electricity is cheap. But the defining events that actually really kicked off flexible consumption, that was the energy crisis we saw in 2022 as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and very high electricity prices. So they suddenly had a kick where everything then started to work together. And that's how I will explain here. And I can see that the clock is not counting, but so if you can. I get to talk forever. So otherwise, stop me when okay, good. So if we look at what happened in 2022, there on the one hand, you need to look at the European electricity system. We have a European electricity market, so we are all influenced in Europe by what's happening in all countries. And in Europe, around 25% is thermal, a mix of gas and coal. We have 33% nuclear, 25% wind and solar, and then some hydro. But what happened in 22 was, on the one hand, very, very high gas prices because we stopped importing from Russia and then had to reduce gas. It was, but also import as LNG. So gas prices very high. But at the same time, it was also a relative dry year. So there was not much hydro. And also the cooling for the thermal power plants and also for the nuclear was reduced. So also there was reduced production from nuclear and hydro. So all in all, it was a perfect storm where we then saw prices around up to $540 per megawatt hours. And the way it works in Denmark is that the market wholesale price is directly forwarded to the consumer, together then with tariffs for the transmission and distribution and also some taxes. Though the taxes, they were removed in the autumn of 2022. But we saw these very high peak prices. And so with the flexibility for the consumer, we actually gave the consumer a choice to reduce their electricity bill. So by not using electricity in the evening, where it was most expensive to serve a cold sandwich instead of the hot lasagne, you gave them a choice to reduce their electricity bill, and that really influenced the behavior of our consumers. So what we saw, I think now there's a pointer here, was the very high prices in 22, and this was the more normal level in 20 and a little bit higher in 21. And we then saw a quite large reduction in especially peak consumption. And I think you showed a number of around 10 to 14% of peak flexibility. That's also what we saw in our consumption. But at the same time, we also saw a smaller increase than in off-peak. So some of the flexibility was then reduced consumption, but also some removed consumption. So, and you say that, as you can see here, the prices in the evening and also in the morning were very high, and especially in the evening we saw a reduction in consumption, whereas we say in the morning we still needed our hot coffee. So, but what then facilitated this was, on the one hand, that by law all households should have smart meters by 2020, paid by the distribution companies. And also, we had the possibility to what we can say call pay per hour, or what you call time of use. So, and we then saw a shift where up to 70% of all consumers actually changed to paying per hour instead of having a fixed rate. And the fixed rate is only fixed for 3 months at the time. And with these increasing prices, we then also saw the fixed rate got actually quite high. And then you pay that fixed rate for all hours. But when you go to the pay per hour, then you choose when you want to use electricity. And you actually got a quite large reduction in your electricity bill by going to pay per hour instead of having the fixed rate. So, but now the crisis is almost over. We are back to more normal electricity prices. But what we see is that peak is still relatively low, and especially increase in off-peak. And this is for households. So this is, you don't know exactly what is driving this, but we expect it to be especially charging of electrical vehicles, but also the use of heat pumps. There was a change from gas for heating to heat pumps also in 2022. So there has been an increase. So the effect that we saw from 2022 is still there. And it's giving us then some ideas what is then actually the flexibility in the system without us actually doing anything as a system operator. This is driven by the electricity price. Also, around 60% of all households are heated by district heating. And in our district heating sector, there also is a shift from gas and biomass to very large heat pump and large electric boilers. And here we can also see quite large increase, especially in the off-peak hours. So the flexibility from our district heating sector is also very large and really supporting the flexibility in our system. So this is when we say that maybe half of all consumption can be flexible, then it's you can say all the new consumption that we'll see in our system from electrical vehicles, from heating, that it is actually very flexible. And without us actually doing anything, it is just forwarding the wholesale price to the consumers. And so to give an example of this is, you say, me as a consumer, this is the price I see. This is from average price from August 2023. It could have been any week in any month, where you have the wholesale electricity price is directly forwarded in my electricity bill. We have then the distribution tariff, and it's time dependent, so it's a bit higher here in the morning and very high here in the evening. Then there is the transmission and system operation tariff that's paid to us. It is still the same, not time dependent. Then we have a electricity tax quite high, and also then a VAT, also a tax on our electricity. So of course, when you have half of our electricity bill is taxes, then you look at your efficiency and how much electricity you use. But when you use it, that is influenced by the wholesale price and also then the time-dependent tariffs. And this really has an influence in how electricity is used. And now this is from my electricity supplier. In other areas of Denmark, the difference in these tariffs, time-dependent tariffs, is even higher. And there you can really see up to also a 20% change in peak demand. So what do I do, and what do a lot of Danes do? Well, we have this app on our iPhone, and we can go in and see our own electricity consumption continuously. This app is for free. The guy that has invented this, he of course gets some money from commercials, and also he has developed some extra services. For example, that you can do a 7-day forecast instead of 1-day forecast, and also you can get some extra information on how to handle each of your applications at home. So if you want to control your heating or your charger or refrigerator, you can choose to do that. But it was the most downloaded app in 2022. We are 5 million people or 6 million people in Denmark, but it was downloaded around 1 million times in 2022. So now everybody has this app. And also what we see now is that when we have lunch or talk with our neighbors over the hedge, then we discuss, okay, have you seen the prices? What did you do? And even sometimes we have quite negative prices. So then they say, oh, remember to charge your car tomorrow, because then you will actually get money back because of the high negative prices that we see in our bills. So also just having a quite simple app like this is also really then pushing for changing our behavior as a consumer. So, and then just one word on balancing, because it's not all about consumers just reacting on the wholesale price. Consumption is also very important for our real-time balancing of our system. And what we see today, when we look at the technologies that have been approved for delivering services, then all this green one, that is our electric boilers in our district heating system. And I think compared to the US, we actually don't have any batteries, only a very small share from batteries. So I think this is the light blue one here is the share from batteries. All the other ones, that is different types of consumption. And we have then, so still some thermal power plants, and then wind turbines as well, delivering services. And if I updated it with the latest number here for our first half of 24, we would also see that solar is also delivering then a lot of our services. And especially then our offshore wind parks are very important here, because it's a New England area, and offshore wind is being developed here. So they can actually really do a lot and deliver a lot of very reliable ancillary services. So, yeah. So just one word on that. So finally, we are looking into a large change in consumption, as is the case here in the US as well. A lot of it is from district heating, it's from data centers, and then also we expect to see a lot of hydrogen being produced, because we have a lot of offshore wind that can produce this hydrogen. And we expect it to a large degree to be flexible. So when we say that half of our demand will be flexible, then it is a lot of this new demand. And what I've learned here during these days also is that data centers can probably be to some degree flexible, because at the moment we assume they're not flexible, but data centers is something we really try to focus on. So yeah, I think that was my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. As they say, never let a good crisis go to waste. So at least we got some flexibility out of it. And Zach, you can now go back to your CEO and just say, all you have to do is quadruple the price of electricity and then double it again with taxes. And turns out people, I have a question coming up about how frustrated people got during that. So our next presentation is from Selin, and this one I really appreciate it because I have to admit I had a little bit of FOMO not being in the resource adequacy session. And so, okay, so, but what's great about this is you're combining the two together, and a really great way to end it out and talking about load flexibility and the resource adequacy or reliability contributions of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Selin. I work for Newton Energy Group. We are the makers of Enelytix powered by PSO. So I'll approach this from a bulk system point of view today. How do we, as a wholesale system, use DERs as an asset efficiently, both in operations and planning? Of course, there are a lot of hurdles there. We've been talking about those in this workshop. One of which is it requires an integrated view between transmission and distribution and challenges there, but the importance of it was discussed on the first day tutorial. But FERC Order 2222 definitely as a milestone started the momentum, but still a lot to decide, you know, what type of structural participation models are there going to be, how to mix DERs that are of different technology. There's actually an ESIG report that came out in 2022, I believe, on DER participation in wholesale markets. That is very extensive report, and I'm looking forward to the new one as well. But in my talk today, I will focus on what are the right signals from the wholesale side to send to these type of participants. You know, how to measure when and where are they are most valuable to the adequacy and reliability of the system. So if you think of the slide that Derek showed with the 5 challenges, I guess this is going to be focusing on the last 2. So performance, how do you account for the performance of DERs, and also the incentives. What are the right incentives? But going back to how is wholesale overall system resource adequacy been done traditionally, it's mostly done on copper plate or zonal models. But the question is, can we afford to do that in today's grid with increasing renewables and dynamics of the system? Can we afford to ignore local transmission and rely on approximations of zonal transfer limits? Right. It usually uses stylized view of operational details. But again, the question there is, can we afford to ignore those? And can we value the true flexibility of DERs if we ignore the operational realities of the system? Or can we measure where and when the DERs will be most valuable if we don't consider all these operational limitations? Resource adequacy has mostly been approached as a planning tool, but it's also becoming increasingly about reliability, operational planning timeframe. And it's using system level metrics that are not applicable in the presence of transmission constraints. And Alex Rutkevich has a paper on that, I believe, showing that 10 years ago that came out. I forgot to put the reference here. But the idea is that to be able to allow the DERs to efficiently contribute to the adequacy or the reliability of the system, it requires a high resolution analysis and metrics on the wholesale side. So what should that look like is going to be the topic I'll talk about today. So it starts with sending the right signals to them, understanding where and when DERs are more valuable to the bulk system. We need to do a high resolution analysis for that and use high resolution metrics, right? The first part is the locational granularity. The metrics and methods should capture the where aspect of it, locational signals, nodally at each substation, perhaps. DERs that are storage and storage-like resources, there's a time coupling there, right? the decisions I make now is going to impact this reliability outcomes in later hours because of this energy limitation of the system, right? So we need to use metrics that should be able to capture that intertemporal coupling as well. The traditional metrics we use today do not really capture that. I'll talk about that more. And also we need to consider the operational realities of the overall system to be able to measure or value the flexibility of the DERs in a correct way. So we think marginal metrics do that, analogous to locational marginal prices that we use today, basically measuring the impact to the system unserved energy given a change in load or resource capacity at each location and each hour in the system. So these send the right signal for when and where resources, DERs, are needed. It can be applied in the planning and operational planning timeframe, right? If we think of the traditional metrics, there's a consensus today that the single dimensional metrics like LOLH, LOLE do not do justice, right? It doesn't distinguish between the severity of events and so on. So it's usually proposed to be augmented by the unserved energy metric, which is great, but because of this intertemporal coupling, we need to take that one step further and go to the marginal metrics. And that's because of the storage-like resources and storage type of constraints, right? The critical hours in the system might not necessarily be event hours, right? We have some hours where there's no load shed, but it's still a critical hour because of this time coupling. And I'll show that on a very simple example. But a marginal metrics at the end, they can be used to capture the individual contribution from any type of system asset, right? Generation, transmission, and demand side participants. So marginal metrics are being recognized by ISOs. There has been a lot of proposals and implementations. ISO New England has a marginal reliability impact metric. It's already being used in their capacity demand curves, but it's also proposed to be used as an accreditation mechanism. And other ISOs are also implementing similar methodologies. So I'll illustrate what do I mean by marginal reliability metrics in a very simple 3-bus, 3-hour system. We have this 3-bus system that is sufficient in terms of system level capacity and demand in every hour. But because of limited transmission between locations B and C, we observe a load shed in location B, right? So because of the local congestion, we can still see events happening. But the question is, in a simple system like this, how do we measure where DER is most valuable to the system, right? If we focus on where the load shed is happening, location B, of course, adding a 1 megawatt of injection at that location will reduce the system unserved demand, unserved energy by 1 megawatt, right? It's straightforward. If we focus on location C, where we have some thermal generator that still has some margin, 1 megawatt of dispatch at that location will not do anything for the system unserved energy because of limited transmission, right? It has no contribution. If we think of location A, because of the counterflows, if we add a 1 megawatt dispatch there, it will reduce the unserved energy by 0.5 megawatt. But similarly, we can measure this for transmission asset as well. If we added a 1 megawatt of capacity on this transmission line between location B and C, that would also reduce the system unserved energy by 1 megawatt, essentially the same reliability effect as load reduction in B, right? So what I want to emphasize here is that this metric allows us to measure the relative efficiency of adding capacity or adding dispatch in different locations in the system, but also compare the value of transmission and value of adding capacity in different locations. Right, so traditional metrics unserved energy, it doesn't capture this information we get from the marginal metrics, the locational risk and the relative efficiency between locations and assets. Now going to the when aspect, right? When is DER most valuable to the system? So I'll go to this one that shows it in a more zoomed version. But so this is showing basically the 3-hour dispatch of the system. The thermal capacity we cannot move because of limited transmission. Solar we cannot move because it's generating at the maximum radiation anyways. So in the first 2 hours, we have unserved energy, right? If you think of the marginal unserved energy, then of course it's going to be 1, right? Or if you add a dollar value to that, the prices are going to be set to value of lost load. We can think of it that way too. Hour 3, we have a battery dispatch, but we don't have any unserved energy event. But if you think of adding a 1 megawatt demand in that critical location to the system, that means the battery we have there is going to have to discharge 1 more megawatt. But what does that mean for other hours? That means in other hours now, we're going to have to discharge the battery less, right? Which means the decision that we make in the 3rd hour, even though we don't have an event at that hour, is going to impact or worsen the reliability events in the first 2 hours, right? So because of that, the marginal unserved energy in the 3rd hour is also going to be reflecting the system risk, right? So, and again, if you think of the primal type of metrics like unserved energy, LOLE, it doesn't capture this intertemporal coupling. So you might be thinking, great, Selin, you showed this on a 3-bus example. Can we do this for real size markets? Augmenting with probabilistic analysis, multiple weather years, weather scenarios, and multiple trajectories of system outages with operational details and transmission constraints that we talked about. The answer is yes. Cloud computing is a big part of that, parallelizing the weather scenarios and the system outage scenarios. But also we use some scenario reduction techniques. We have a paper on this. I put the references here, as well as a prior ESIC presentation, I believe exactly a year ago. We went into more detail on how we do this efficiently. But we have 2 examples. One is from MISO. We partnered with MISO on an RPE project on nodal short-term resource adequacy. So the example I will show is a day-ahead operation and planning example with 100 short-term weather scenarios applied to as a backcast simulation of Winter Storm Uri in 2021. Another one is ERCOT. We tried an annual planning type of adequacy analysis there, again nodal with operational details. They're just single weather scenario. But a quick example of the MISO work, this is essentially looking into the day-ahead conditions of February 16th. So what forecast does the operator have on February 15th? And how will those commitment decisions play out with the 100 short-term weather scenarios? So one thing I want to emphasize here, and what caused the things go wrong in the Winter Storm Uri, is that the day-ahead forecast of outages was much less compared to what went on outage the next day. So when we put this in the adequacy simulation, nodal adequacy simulation with 100 weather scenarios, this is basically a heat map in MISO of the marginal unserved energy. The bubble size shows the capacity of each injector, but the color is the heat map of the marginal unserved energy. So we can see that South was suffering a lot, which was aligned with historical situation back then. But we also see within South that risk varies, the marginal unserved energy varies due to local congestion, right? So what if we provide this as signals to DER aggregators and flexible demand, right? We can take very local actions based on this information. Another example is ERCOT. This is, again, high resolution annual planning, just a single weather scenario. But what I want to emphasize here is that we can see shortage conditions even in months with enough margin, right? Because of local congestion. And that's what we observed in the month of December here. We did have excess supply in the overall system, but we still had these pockets in the system. You can see that a light green area in the map, in the heat map, that were suffering because of local congestion, right? So giving this as a signal to the participants, right? That's the idea. And of course, big part of this, when we think of DR participation in wholesale markets, is coordination between wholesale and distribution. There's going to be a lot of interactions there, but there's an opportunity there to use the nodal level resolution that we can get from wholesale to precisely manage events and transmission congestion associated with these events, right? But of course, the distribution system has its distinct and separate criteria today to manage events. So how can the wholesale system use that to more efficiently manage the load shed events, right? So there are some questions there to address. I don't necessarily know the answers, but I just wanted to pose these questions, and they're more directed to the distribution side. But what are the criteria and policies that the distribution system use that the wholesale system can factor in planning and operation? How can the distribution system benefit from this high resolution wholesale signals, both hourly and locationally? Is substation resolution sufficient for the aggregators? Maybe it's sufficient for some participation models. Do we need more granular signals within the distribution system, and what are the barriers to those, right? But we were brainstorming with a colleague from a utility, and this is sort of an example exchange of information that we can have between wholesale and distribution. So wholesale can provide this locational and hourly high resolution risk information to distribution, and perhaps the distribution side can use that during critical events, deciding where to put mobile generators, right? And how to manage DERs. At the same time, distribution system has its own feeder level characterizations, right? So shedding load 1 megawatt from one substation to another, it has differences for the transmission system because of congestion, of course, but it also has differences for the distribution system. Some feeders have a lot of critical loads, has more DERs, has environmental justice customers. Transformer status becomes very important on high heat days. So can the wholesale factor those in when to make the load shed or event management decisions more efficient? Can see the time because I'm too short, but okay. But I think that's all I had. Thank you. Looking forward to the discussion.